January 1945. A heavy winter presses down on Central Europe. Inside a command bunker, maps covered the walls. Not the clean, confident arrows of earlier years, but torn edges, broken lines, red markings closing in from every direction. The air smells of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. Outside, artillery rumbles in the distance. Not advancing, not retreating. Who's constant? German officers stand in silence. No one speaks at first, not because there is nothing to say, but because everyone already understands. Reports arrive one after another. Armies retreating faster than orders can be written. Fuel reserves measured in days. Divisions that exist only on paper. Cities erased by bombers before reinforcements can even be assembled. The numbers no longer lie. They no longer can. For years, German commanders had spoken of reversals, of temporary setbacks, of miracle weapons and final offensives. But now the language has changed. Not outwardly, orders are still issued. Defense is still planned, but inwardly, something has shifted. This is not a moment of panic. It is a moment of clarity. And once that clarity sets in, the war does not end, but it is already lost. The realization did not arrive all at once. It was built slowly, battle by battle, decision by decision, until inevitability became impossible to ignore. To understand how German commanders reached that moment, we must step back into the path that led them there. When the war began in September 1939, German commanders believed they were witnessing the rebirth of decisive warfare. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. The Low Countries were overrun with speed that stunned the world. The campaigns appeared to validate everything the German General Staff had studied since the First World War: mobility, concentration of force, and initiative at the operational level. By 1941, confidence was not merely high, it was institutionalized. The German army had not just won battles, it had reshaped how war itself was understood. Officers who had spent the interwar years preparing for limited, defensive conflicts now found themselves commanding vast mechanized formations across an entire continent. The victories came so fast that reflection lagged behind success. But those victories carried hidden costs. The German war effort was built on assumptions that could not survive a long, global conflict. Speed was expected to compensate for limited resources. Initiative was expected to overcome numerical inferiority. And political objectives were allowed to override military restraint. None of these weaknesses were fatal in short campaigns. Together, they became decisive liabilities over time. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked the first major rupture between expectation and reality. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a campaign of months. Instead, it became a war of attrition measured in years. The distances were vast. The enemy did not collapse. Logistics strained beyond design. Casualties mounted at a pace Germany could not replace indefinitely. By the winter of 1941-42, German commanders were already adjusting their internal language. Publicly, operations were described as ongoing successes delayed by weather. Privately, reports began to reflect concern. Equipment losses outpaced production. Infantry divisions shrank. Fuel and ammunition planning became increasingly optimistic projections rather than firm calculations. Still, belief endured. The German command culture prized endurance and adaptation. Setbacks were not defeat, they were challenges to be solved. That belief was shaken but not destroyed. The encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army in early 1943 was unprecedented in German military history. An entire field, army over 250,000 men was lost. For the first time, senior officers confronted not just tactical failure, but strategic impossibility. Relief operations had failed. Air supply proved insufficient. The enemy had learned how to counter German operational doctrine. Yet even Stalingrad did not end confidence outright. Many commanders viewed it as a singular catastrophe rather than a pattern. They pointed to remaining strengths: experienced leadership, disciplined troops, technological innovation. They argued that the Eastern Front could be stabilized, that a decisive battle could still be forced on favorable terms. That decisive battle was attempted at Kursk in the summer of 1943. Kursk was meant to restore initiative. Instead, it exposed Germany's diminishing margin for error. The offensive was anticipated, delayed, and then absorbed by layered Soviet defenses. Losses in men and armor were heavy and irreplaceable. When the offensive stalled, the Red Army counterattacked along the entire front. From that moment onward, the strategic balance shifted permanently. German commanders now faced a war on multiple fronts that could not be synchronized. In the east, the Soviet Union fielded growing armies supported by expanding industrial output. In the west, Allied air power reached deep into the Reich, dismantling transportation networks and industrial capacity. In the Mediterranean, resources were drained into secondary theaters that produced no decisive results. The war Germany was fighting in 1943 was no longer the war it had prepared for. Commanders began to notice changes that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Replacement troops arrived with less training. Officers were promoted faster, with less experience. Divisions that once operated independently now relied on fragile supply chains, vulnerable to air attack. Orders increasingly emphasized holding ground rather than maneuver and admission that mobility had been lost. Still, outward discipline remained. Staff conferences continued. Operational plans were drawn. The structure of command held together. But beneath it, a quiet awareness was forming. The war was no longer about winning quickly or winning decisively. It was becoming a question of endurance, and Germany's reserves of endurance were finite. By the end of 1943, German commanders were no longer asking how to defeat their enemies. They were asking how long they could delay the inevitable. That question would define everything that followed. By 1944, the war had entered a phase German commanders had never truly planned for: irreversible decline. Not collapse, not yet, but a steady, measurable erosion of every advantage that had once defined German power. The fronts still existed. The armies still fought. But the foundations beneath them were crumbling. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army no longer attacked in isolated offensives. It advanced in waves. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, shattered Army Group Center with a force and coordination that left little room for recovery. Entire corps were annihilated. Command posts were overrun. Communications failed, not because of chaos, but because the enemy moved faster than the German command system could respond. The scale of the defeat was unmistakable. More than 300,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in weeks. For senior commanders, this was no longer a question of tactics or leadership. The enemy possessed superiority in manpower, armor, artillery, and air support, and used it systematically. At the same time, the Western Front opened in a way Germany could not counter. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 created a second major front, backed by overwhelming industrial capacity. German commanders understood the imbalance immediately. The issue was not bravery or competence. It was the Allies could replace losses indefinitely. Germany could not. Air superiority sealed that reality. Allied aircraft controlled the skies over France and Germany itself. Movement by day became hazardous. Rail lines were severed faster than they could be repaired. Fuel depots vanished overnight. Even when units existed on paper, they could not be moved or supplied in time to matter. German armies in the west were retreating toward their own borders. The failure to contain the Normandy breakout, followed by the collapse in France, forced commanders to confront a war now being fought on German soil. This was a psychological turning point. The conflict was no longer distant. Cities, families, and civilian infrastructure were now part of the battlefield. The High Command attempted to regain initiative with limited counteroffensives. The most ambitious came in December 1944, in the Ardennes. Officially, it was framed as a decisive blow, a chance to split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace. Privately, many senior officers viewed it as a gamble, born of desperation. The offensive achieved initial surprise, but surprise was not enough. Fuel shortages halted armored columns. Allied air power returned as weather cleared. German losses mounted rapidly. When the offensive stalled, The last strategic reserve was gone. For those inside German headquarters, the conclusion was unavoidable. There were no reserves left to commit, no new formations waiting in depth, no hidden industrial surge. The maps told the story with brutal clarity. Red arrows pressing from the east, blue arrows advancing from the west, and shrinking space in between. By early 1945, the Red Army crossed the Oder River. Berlin lay within artillery range. On the western side, Allied forces crossed the Rhinan obstacle German planners had once believed could be held indefinitely. The heart of the Reich was now exposed. Commanders continued to issue orders. Defensive lines were drawn, counterattacks were planned. But the language had changed again. Objectives were no longer decisive victories. They were delays. Days gained. Our spot. Fuel allocations were counted in single digits. Infantry divisions reported rifle strength in the hundreds. Tanks were moved without air cover, fully aware they would be destroyed. Commanders understood these facts, even as they sent men forward. The German command system did not collapse into chaos. It functioned grimly, methodically long after it ceased to offer solutions. Professional duty carried officers forward, even as strategic belief faded. B.T.'s point. Many commanders no longer believed Germany could win the war. What remained was uncertainty over something more personal. How it would end, and who would survive it. The moment of inevitability was approaching not as a single event, but as a convergence. To understand that convergence, we must examine how different perspectives, human, tactical, technological, and moral, shaped the realization taking hold within the German command structure. The realization of inevitable defeat did not arrive the same way for every German commander. It formed differently depending on position, responsibility, and proximity to reality. To understand when belief finally gave way to certainty, it is necessary to examine the war from several distinct angles, each revealing a different facet of the same truth. Angle 1. The psychological perspective. When professional faith erodes. German officers were trained to endure uncertainty. Doubt was considered a weakness. Adaptability was a virtue. For years, this mindset allowed commanders to rationalize defeat as delay and loss as opportunity. But by late 1944, something more corrosive set in. Senior officers began to experience a quiet internal conflict between professional obligation and personal awareness. They continued to plan operations they no longer believed would succeed. Briefings became exercises in precision rather than persuasion. No one argued openly, but enthusiasm disappeared. This psychological shift was not panic. It was resignation. Commanders stopped asking if a line could be held and began asking how long it would last. The mental framework of victory, so central to military leadership, was replaced by calculation and containment. This was the first moment many officers understood defeat was not a possibility. It was a process already underway. Angle 2. The operational perspective maps that offered no solutions. Operations rooms once symbolized control. Colored pins measured advances, arrows sweeping across borders. By 1945, those same maps became instruments of truth. German commanders faced a fundamental operational dilemma. Every option led to loss. Retreat risked encirclement. Holding ground invited destruction. Counterattacks consumed irreplaceable reserves. There were no maneuver spaces left, no flanks to exploit, no strategic depth. Orders increasingly contradicted battlefield reality. Units were told to hold positions without ammunition. Armored formations were assigned missions without fuel. Commanders knew these orders could not be fulfilled, but issued them anyway. Not because they believed they would work, but because there was nothing else to issue. For officers trained to think in movement and initiative, this operational paralysis was devastating. The war had become static, not by design, but by exhaustion. Angle 3. The technological perspective, weapons that arrived too late. German leadership had long placed faith in technological superiority. New tanks, new aircraft, advanced submarines each promised to restore balance or regain initiative. By late war, these weapons did exist, but they arrived in isolation. Jet aircraft lacked fuel and trained pilots. Advanced tanks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Production facilities were bombed before output reached meaningful levels. Commanders understood that technology could not compensate for numbers, logistics, or air control. The myth of the decisive weapon collapsed quietly, not in speeches but in staff assessments and supply reports. Commanders who had once advocated innovation now confronted its limits. Technology was no longer a path to victory only, a footnote in a war already decided by scale. Each of these angles pointed to the same conclusion. The war was no longer being shaped by German decisions. It was being endured. But not all perspectives came from within German lines. To fully grasp the moment, inevitability became undeniable. We must also examine how the enemy perceived Germany's condition, and how moral and human considerations completed the realization. By the final year of the war, the understanding of defeat was no longer confined to German headquarters. It was visible to the enemy, written into battlefield behavior, and felt in the moral and human dimensions of command. These remaining angles completed the picture that German commanders could no longer ignore. Angle 4. The enemy's perspective. When opponents stop fearing you, one of the clearest indicators of Germany's decline came not from internal reports, but from enemy conduct. Allied and Soviet forces no longer treated German positions as unpredictable or dangerous obstacles. They planned methodically. They advanced deliberately. On the Eastern Front, Soviet operations demonstrated a confidence absent in earlier years. Attacks were launched simultaneously across broad sectors. Reserves were committed without hesitation. Losses were accepted because replacements were available. In the West, Allied commanders no longer feared counteroffensives beyond temporary disruption. When German attacks occurred, they were contained, analyzed, and absorbed. German commanders recognized this shift immediately. War, at its core, is a contest of uncertainty. When one side loses the ability to surprise, to threaten, or to impose doubt, the contest is effectively over. Their enemies no longer fought Germany as a peer. Angle 5. The moral perspective duty. After hope ends, German officers were bound by oath, tradition, and professional identity. Many had served through earlier defeats and believed endurance itself was a form of honor. But late in the war, the moral burden changed. Commanders knew that continued resistance would not alter the outcome. Yet surrender without authorization was considered treason. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat but between obedience and responsibility. Some officers justified continued fighting as a way to protect civilians or delay occupation. Others followed orders simply because the structure of command demanded it. Very few believed in final victory. This moral tension between what must be done and what could be achieved marked a profound shift. When commanders act without belief, the war enters its final phase. Angle 6. The human perspective, thinking beyond the war. As defeat became inevitable, German commanders began thinking not in campaigns, but in consequences. What would happen after the war? To their soldiers, their families, the country itself. This shift did not lead to open defiance, but it altered priorities. Some sought to preserve units from annihilation. Others focused on minimizing destruction. Many began documenting decisions, aware they would one day be judged. The war had ceased to be about triumph. It had become about survival, accountability, and memory. When commanders start planning for the aftermath, while battles still rage, the war's outcome is already decided. All these angles, psychological, operational, technological, enemy, moral, and human, converged by early 1945. The realization was no longer abstract. It was complete. What remained was the moment when that realization crystallized. When the final illusions collapsed under the weight of undeniable events, that moment would come, not in a single explosion, but in a sequence of turning points that left no room for doubt. The moment German commanders understood defeat was inevitable did not arrive with a single report or a single battle. It emerged through a series of confirmations, each one removing another remaining excuse, another possible alternative, another illusion of recovery. By January 1945, the evidence converged. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Odera Offensive. In less than 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced hundreds of kilometers. German defensive lines that had been planned for months collapsed in days. Entire formations disintegrated before they could redeploy. The speed of the advance stunned even those who had expected defeat. For German commanders, this offensive was decisive not because of its scale, but because of its certainty. There was no operational response available, no reserve army to counterattack, no defensive depth to absorb the blow. The front did not bend. It broke. Reports arriving at headquarters were no longer requests for reinforcement. They were notifications of disappearance. Divisions ceased to exist between one situation map and the next. Communication lines went silent without explanation. At the same time, in the West, Allied forces completed their crossing of the Rhine. This was not a breakthrough, it was a confirmation. The last natural defensive barrier Germany had relied upon was gone. The assumption that the Rhine could delay or deter invasion proved false. German commanders now faced a two-front collapse inside Germany itself. Strategic discussions narrowed dramatically. There was no talk of regaining territory, no discussion of decisive engagements. Conferences focused instead on fallback lines that could not be held and cities that could not be defended. One of the most telling changes occurred in how time was discussed. Earlier in the war, time had been a resource to be exploited used to prepare offensives or consolidate gains. Now, time became something to be survived. Every decision was measured in days, sometimes hours. Delay became the only remaining objective. Fuel shortages intensified the crisis. Armored units were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. Aircraft remained grounded due to lack of aviation fuel. Artillery batteries rationed shells to symbolic levels. German commanders were no longer directing a modern mechanized war. They were managing collapse. Inside staff meetings, the language remained formal. Orders were precise, but beneath the professionalism, a quiet consensus emerged. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood. The war could no longer be won militarily. The last hope for altering the outcome had rested on the possibility of political fracture among the Allies, or a negotiated settlement. By early 1945, that hope vanished as well. Allied coordination strengthened rather than weakened. Conferences confirmed unified objectives. Unconditional surrender was no longer rhetoric. It was policy. German commanders absorbed this reality with grim clarity. The war would not end on German terms. It would end by force. The final illusion collapsed when Berlin itself came under direct threat. Soviet artillery positions crept closer each day. The capital was no longer a symbolic center, it was a battlefield waiting to happen. At this point, command decisions took on a different character. They were no longer attempts to change history, but to endure it. Officers continued to fulfill their roles, fully aware of the outcome. This was the moment when inevitability became internalized. Not feared, not debated, accepted. Yet acceptance did not bring surrender. Orders were still issued. Men were still sent into combat. The machinery of war continued to move even as belief had stopped driving it. The war had entered its final contradiction. Absolute clarity paired with continued violence. And with that contradiction came the final phase, the last acts of command in a war already decided. Once inevitability was accepted, German command decisions changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The war no longer revolved around victory or even stalemate. It revolved around control of space, of time, and, increasingly, of narrative. By February 1945, senior commanders understood that no strategic maneuver could reverse events. What remained was the question of how Germany would lose. On the Eastern Front, defensive planning around Berlin revealed the depth of this realization. The capital was declared a fortress, yet commanders knew it lacked the forces, supplies, and air cover required for prolonged defense. Units assigned to protect it were under strength, poorly equipped, and often composed of hastily assembled formations. The orders to defend Berlin were not issued because they were believed to succeed, but because not issuing them was unthinkable within the existing command structure. At the same time, commanders faced an internal contradiction. They recognized that further resistance would increase civilian suffering and military casualties without altering the outcome. Yet the political environment left no space for open dissent. Decisions became acts of compliance rather than conviction. This produced a distinct pattern in late-war operations. Commanders sought to slow advances rather than stop them. They withdrew units before complete encirclement, when possible. They prioritized evacuation of wounded and civilians where they could. These were not acts of rebellion but quiet acknowledgments of reality. The collapse of the Eastern Front accelerated relentlessly. Soviet forces crossed the Oder and Nisa rivers. German counterattacks were localized, short-lived, and unsustainable. Commanders reported success measured in hours, gained rather than objectives secured. In the West, Allied forces advanced into central Germany with minimal resistance in many sectors. When resistance did occur, it was often disconnected units fighting in isolation, unaware of broader collapse. This fragmentation reflected the deeper breakdown of command coherence. Orders were still transmitted, but coordination dissolved under pressure. The war's final months were marked not by grand maneuvers, but by disintegration. For German commanders, the decisive realization came when no decision they made could alter the trajectory. Every choice led to the same conclusion. Hold a city, lose it. Counterattack, lose men. Withdraw, lose territory. Strategic agency had vanished. What replaced it was endurance. Commanders continued to act because stopping meant admitting final defeat, and that admission carried consequences they were unprepared or unwilling to face. Even as Berlin was encircled, some commanders focused on the West rather than the East, not to win but to surrender to a different enemy. This, too, reflected inevitability. The war was no longer about preventing defeat, but about shaping its aftermath. By April 1945, Soviet artillery thundered into Berlin. The city became a battlefield of ruins. Inside command bunkers, the last conferences were held. Maps were updated more out of habit than hope. The realization that had been forming for months now required no confirmation. Germany had lost the war. Not in a single battle, not in a single order, but through exhaustion, imbalance, and time. The moment of inevitability was complete, not because the fighting ended, but because belief did. And when belief disappears, the outcome of war is no longer in doubt. What followed was not strategy, but consequence. When inevitability became undeniable, its effects moved faster than armies. The German command structure did not collapse overnight. It unraveled in stages through surrender, fragmentation, and silence. In the weeks following the encirclement of Berlin, entire formations ceased to exist, not through annihilation, but through disintegration. Units surrendered independently. Commanders acted without guidance. Orders arrived too late or not at all. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's final assaults overwhelmed what remained of organized resistance. Cities fell one after another. Königsberg, Breslau, Vienna. Each loss confirmed what German commanders already knew. There would be no negotiated end, no pause, no reversal. In the West, Allied forces advanced rapidly across central and southern Germany. The collapse there was often quieter. Germanisches surrenderet en masse. White flags appeared where defenses had once been planned. Commanders chose capitulation, not out of cowardice, but calculation. Further resistance served no purpose. The most telling sign of defeat was not battlefield loss, it was the absence of direction. By late April 1945, the German High Command existed more as a formality than a functioning institution. Communication between fronts broke down. Field commanders made independent decisions based on circumstance rather than strategy. Some sought to preserve their troops. Others focused on evacuating civilians. Many simply waited. Berlin's fall marked the symbolic end of centralized command. With the capital surrounded and leadership isolated, there was no longer a center from which the war could be directed. Orders issued from within the city carried no practical authority beyond its ruins. For commanders who had spent careers mastering coordination and control, this dissolution was profound. The war ended not with a final plan, but with the disappearance of planning itself. Casualty figures underscored the scale of loss. Millions of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Infrastructure lay shattered. Transportation networks were destroyed. Industry was Germany's ability to wage war had been arrested not temporarily, but completely. The psychological impact on surviving commanders was equally severe. Many had understood defeat months earlier, but witnessing its final expression left no refuge for denial. The war they had fought, believed in, and sustained no longer existed. Some commanders attempted to justify their decisions in reports and memoirs. Others refused to speak. Silence became its own response. Yet even in defeat, patterns emerged. Those who had recognized inevitability earlier often acted differently in the final weeks. They avoided futile counterattacks. They limited destruction where possible. They surrendered when further resistance meant only loss. These actions did not change history, but they reflected an internal reckoning that had already taken place. The German military did not lose the war because it stopped fighting. It stopped believing because it could no longer fight meaningfully. And once belief collapsed, the end became a matter of time. That time would now be measured not in battles but in consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. After the fighting stopped, the realization that had taken hold during the war's final months did not fade. It deepened. German commanders emerged from defeat into captivity, interrogation rooms, and eventually courtrooms. The war was over, but the questions surrounding it had only begun. For many, the most difficult question was not how Germany lost, but when they themselves had known it was lost. In the immediate aftermath, Allied intelligence sought answers. Interrogations focused on timelines, decisions, and moments of awareness. Again and again, senior officers described a gradual understanding rather than a single revelation. They spoke of dwindling options, of arithmetic that could no longer be ignored, of conferences where plans were drafted despite the absence of belief. Some commanders admitted privately that by late 1944, defeat was certain. Others pointed further back to Stalingrad, to Kursk, to the collapse of Army Group Center. The dates varied, but the pattern did not. The realization always preceded the end by months. This gap between knowing and stopping became one of the defining features of Germany's defeat. Posture memoirs reflected this tension. Some officers framed their actions as duty, carried out under impossible conditions. Others emphasized professional constraints, arguing that surrender without authorization would have produced chaos and greater suffering. A few acknowledged moral failure, though often indirectly. What rarely appeared was surprise. Defeat, for the German command, was not sudden. It was lived with. The institutional legacy of this realization shaped post-war military thought. Analysts studied how a highly competent force, led by experienced officers, could continue fighting long after strategic defeat became inevitable. The answer lay not in incompetence but in structure, ideology, and inertia. The German command system was designed to function under pressure. It succeeded even when it should have stopped. For surviving commanders, this raised painful questions about responsibility. Was it enough to recognize inevitability internally while continuing to act externally? Could professionalism excuse participation in a war already known to be lost? These questions had no simple answers. Still, what is certain is that the moment German commanders knew defeat was inevitable did not end the war. It changed its character. From that point forward, decisions were no longer about victory. They were about control, preservation, and survival within a collapsing system. History would judge the outcomes. The commanders lived with the knowledge Germany's defeat reshaped Europe, redrew borders, and redefined warfare. But for those who commanded its armies, the most enduring consequence was internal recognition that understanding reality does not always grant the power to act on it. The war ended in ruins, but its lessons endured. And those lessons point beyond Germany, beyond 1945, towards something universal. To grasp their full meaning, we must step back one final time away from battles and commands. Reflect on what inevitability truly means in war. War is often remembered for its climactic battles, its decisive victories, and its moments of surrender. But for those who fight and command, war is also defined by quieter realizations, moments when outcomes become clear long before they are announced. The German commanders of the Second World War did not all reach that realization at the same time. Some recognized it early, others late. But once it arrived, it did not leave. From that point onward, Every order, every movement, and every sacrifice unfolded under the shadow of an outcome already understood. This is the true weight of inevitability. It is not the end of resistance. It is the end of belief. History shows that wars are not always decided when the final shot is fired. They are often decided earlier, when imbalance becomes irreversible, when choices narrow to variations of loss, and when hope is replaced by calculation. The German experience demonstrates that even highly trained, disciplined leaders can continue fighting long after victory becomes impossible. Not because they are blind, but because systems, oaths, and fear constrain action. Understanding reality does not always grant the freedom to change it. This lesson extends beyond one nation or one conflict. It speaks to the nature of command, responsibility, and human limitation. Knowing the truth is not the same as acting on it, and in war, the distance between those two can be measured in lives. The moment German commanders knew defeat was inevitable was not marked by explosions or announcements. It arrived quietly in reports, in maps, in silence, and once it arrived, history was already decided. War is often remembered for its endings, for surrender documents, ruined capitals, and the silence that follows the last shot. But for those who command armies, war is decided earlier, in moments that never make headlines. The German commanders of the Second World War did not wake one morning to discover defeat. They arrived at it gradually, through numbers that no longer balanced, through maps that offered no solutions, through orders issued without belief. By the time the world saw Germany fall, many of its senior officers had already lived with the knowledge for months. This is the true nature of inevitability in war. It is not the absence of resistance, it is the absence of possibility. From the moment defeat became unavoidable, the conflict changed character. Battles were still fought. Men still died, but strategy gave way to endurance. Command became administration, hope narrowed into delay. The war continued not because it could be won, but because systems, oaths, and fear made stopping unthinkable. History often asks why wars continue when their outcomes are clear. The German experience offers an answer that is both simple and unsettling. Knowing the truth does not always grant the power to act on it. In rigid structures, clarity can arrive long before freedom. For the commanders involved, inevitability carried a unique burden. They were no longer shaping history. They were witnessing it unfold, unable to change its direction, yet still responsible for every decision along the way. The lesson endures beyond Germany, beyond 1945. Wars are not ended by realization alone. They end when belief, authority, and structure collapse together. The moment German commanders knew defeat was inevitable did not stop the war. It merely ensured its conclusion. And by the time that conclusion arrived, it had already been irrevocably long before the final ruins settled into silence.